Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. In this paper of biodiversity and conservation, we have learnt that what is biodiversity, what are different types of biodiversity, what is the importance of biodiversity and what are different activities which are causing loss of biodiversity. In this module, we will learn about keystone species. The learning objectives of this module are to understand the concept of keystone species, how to identify the keystone species, what is the need of keystone species, to understand the types of keystone species, as well as we will try to learn the impacts of loss of keystone species and the associated loss of biodiversity. We will also try to understand the impact of loss of biodiversity and we will try to learn that how to go for the conservation of keystone species. Before we start, let me have some definitions which are very important for the for understanding the biodiversity as well as for understanding the keystone species. First of all, let me come to the keystone species. Keystone species are the species that has a great impact on its community that would be expected by the contribution of its overall number or biomass. Then umbrella species. Umbrella species are the species which are requiring large area of natural habitat for their continuous survival. Then iconic species. Iconic species are the species having cultural significance and are involved in traditional activities and are broadly recognized for their existence and aesthetic values. Then flagship species, the species selected to act as an ambassador, icon or symbol for a defined habitat, issue, campaign or environmental cause, that is called as flagship species. Then by focusing on them, their habitat and other species which share the same habitat can also be conserved. Then guilds. Guilds are a group of species with similar ecological features, similar requirements and play a similar role within a community. Then dominant species. The species which influence community structure primarily by virtue of their great abundance or biomass, they are called as foundation species. Now, let me try to understand the concept and definition of keystone species. Ecologically, keystone species concept is quite alluring. This term was originated by Robert Payne. In his study he conducted in 1966 on a Rocky Shore community in California, where the entire species assemblage collapsed with the top predator, that was a carnivorous starfish, that is also called as yellow starfish, was removed. Keystone species are those whose effect is large and disproportionately large relative to their abundance. Power et al. In 1996 considered keystone species as dominants or the foundation stone species. Mills et al. In 1993 determined the community importance index, that is called as CI also, as the strength of the effect of a species on a community per unit change in a measure of abundance, usually measured in the terms of biomass of that species. This change is measured in terms of a community trait such as productivity, species richness, etc. This effect can be positive or negative. Removal of the species entirely from the community and then measuring the resulting change with respect to a relevant community feature help in determining the community importance index. Generally, a species with an impact proportional to its abundance would have a community importance index of 1, whereas in case of keystone species it would be greater than 1. Now, what is keystoneness? Keystoneness is not an intrinsic property. So, students, please try to understand, keystoneness is not an intrinsic property of a species, but it depends upon the functional role of a species in a particular community. So, we can say keystoneness is due to the functional role played by a species in a particular community. In other words, keystone status of a particular species is entirely context dependent, or it may vary from one ecological situation to another. A species may be keystone species in one ecological situation and may not be keystone species in another ecological situation. Menge et al. In 1994 reported starfish, that is called as yellow starfish, as the keystone species due to its predation on mussels on wave exposed rocky headlands. Another set of experiment by Navarrete and Menge 1996 described that whelks are kind of snails as keystone species in the absence of starfish, but now in their presence, but not in their presence. Thus, we can conclude that keystone role can be adopted by different organisms. Keystone role of a species cannot be really predicted on the basis of life history traits, but can be identified by identifying their role or functions in specific community. Let me give you some examples. Prairie dog is an inhabitant of wild variety of grasslands, but is reported as keystone species in Northern American grasslands. Keystone species is known to maintain the structure of an ecological community. Due to its relative abundance, its impact is greater on the community. Their absence sometimes alters the native ecological community and disturbs many other species, as well as in a negative manner. Generally, keystone species are predators, and even their small population has a great impact on the distribution, number and behavior of prey species. This interdependency among the different components of an ecosystem can be easily understood by these examples. Let me give you one example. Elephants in savanna, they act as keystone species. How they act as keystone species? Let me describe that. Their dependency on acacia for food prevents savanna from turning into woodlands, because if elephants would not feed on acacia, then everywhere there will be acacia, 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 and there will be no more grasslands, rather these will be woodlands. So, these elephants, by feeding on acacia, allows the grasses to flourish well. There benefits other animals, this benefits other animals such as wild beasts, zebras, antelopes, etc. means this benefits other herbivorous animals. Now, a question arises, how to identify a keystone species? The best way to demonstrate the keystone role of an individual species in a particular community is the experimental removal, but it is impractical due to ethical, social, technical and logistical reasons. In this complex scenario, Power et al. In 1996 suggested the combination of manipulative experiment with modeling approaches such as pathway analysis. Following this methodology, one or few strongly interacting species are experimentally reduced or removed, and the following changes are observed in a much wider range of species within the community. Generally, interpretation of removals does not indicate clear results. Moreover, in case of multiple removals, it is often not possible to determine whether the resultant changes are due to that single keystone species or the collective impacts of various members of a trophic level. To overcome experimental manipulations, natural history observations or comparative studies using habitats with varying densities of putative keystone species are employed. Individually, both the approaches lack meticulous results because of the subjective nature of the former case and in the latter due to difference in two sites, since no two sites can be exactly the same. However, in combination, both can be extremely useful for identifying hypotheses and for determining the genuineness of the experimental results. Now, this slide shows that how to determine potential keystone role of species by natural experiments. It can be done by invasion of organisms in new environment, then by over harvesting of natural population and by deliberate eradication of pest species. But these natural experiments have their own drawbacks, and their drawbacks include lack pre-treatment baseline, inability to find comparable non-manipulated sites, and replication of treatment is not feasible in case of natural experiments. Now, the question arises, what is the importance of keystone species? Keystone species influence species diversity. Sometimes keystone species also act as umbrella species which provide protection to many other species. Their health determines the condition of other smaller species. Removal of keystone species from a community initiate a chain reaction and disturb other species, where some species become abundant while other decline. They stabilize the community structure. Their health determines the conditions of other smaller species and stabilize the entire community structure. These two factors have proved elusive for the ecological conservationists in order to focus their conservation efforts. This figure shows the typology of group of species with similar ecological functions within a biological community with respect to their biomass and impact on the ecosystem. If you see on this figure, on the x axis we have biomass of the species, and on the other axis, y axis, we have impact of the species, and based upon that all species can be divided into 4 categories. Type 1 species are the keystone species. Keystone species have lesser biomass, but high impact. Then we have type 2, that is dominant species. Dominant species have large biomass as well as high impact. Then we have type 3, that is rare species. Rare species have small biomass and low impact, whereas type 4 are common species. They have large biomass and low impact. Now, what are different types of keystone species? Keystone species not only control potential dominants, but also provide critical resource. They work as mutualists to modify the environment. They can be classified as following on the basis of their functional role in an ecosystem. So, let me discuss different categories of the keystone species based upon their functional role in the ecosystem. The first category is the organisms regulating dominant species. The best example of keystone species is the one who regulates the population of a potentially dominant species. This reduces competition among other species for a limiting resource and promotes coexistence. Let me take an example. In Paine's Rocky Shore community experiment, the primary resource is space and the dominant species is mussel, and this dominant species tend to occupy the entire rock surface. Here the keystone species is a starfish, that is yellow starfish, that tends to keep the population of mussels in check. Another top predator like Triton gastropod, that is Cheronia, that controls species diversity by eating starfish, thus preventing overconsumption of corals by the starfish. Removal of Triton will not only reduce coral population, but also community degradation at the subsequent levels. The elimination of even a small number of individual predator, although they constitute a minute amount of community biomass, may result in dramatic changes in vegetation and a great loss of biodiversity, and that is called as trophic cascade. Second category of keystone species is resource suppliers. These keystone species provide a vital resource to a range of organisms at the time of paucity, although it occurs seasonally. Sometimes the resource provider itself may not be an abundant species, but in case of its removal, the dependent organisms are not able to meet the supplies. Sometimes keystone plant resources such as fruits are not available in abundance, and animals have to feed on alternate sources of nourishment during seasonal shortage. Let me give you one example. Ficus acts as a keystone resource provider in many tropical forests due to its continuous seasonal fruiting. Specialized wasp pollinators rely on ficus. Further, 29 ficus species in a Malaysian forest acted as keystone resource provider for a variety of frugivorous animals. However, in some forests, ficus trees are scanty in their distribution and act as keystone resource providers for highly mobile species with large home ranges. In some of the tropical forests like Gabon, ficus is not available in plenty to be a keystone resource provider. Rather, the need is fulfilled with two species of Maristicaceae and one of Anonaceae family for frugivorous birds and monkeys. Additionally, presence of microorganisms sometimes enhances a limited nutritional resource. Let me take one example, that after volcanism, nitrogen limited forest communities develop with the help of invasive symbiotic nitrogen fixer, which acts as a keystone resource provider. Enhanced nitrogen ability has subsequent effects in terms of litter accumulation, nutrient cycling, earthworm population, and cause major changes to the formerly open canopied forests. Then third category of keystone species is mutualis. In this case, the two species are mutually dependent on each other, or in other words we can say they act as keystone species for each other. Mutualism can also occur in groups like fruit producers, seed dispersing frugivores, pollinators, and groups of plants. All are mutually dependent on each other. It is a risky strategy and is rarely found in most of the communities. However, it is common in case of orchids and their specialist pollinators. According to Darwin, it is a good example of plant pollinators coevolution. In the fynbos vegetation, number of plants is exclusively pollinated by a sparse fauna of long tongued flies, oil collecting beetles, monkey beetles, carpenter bees, and butterflies. This gives a good example of pollination mutualism. Many a times, one-to-one mutualism could act in a keystone community if any one of the partner had strong interactions with other species in the community. Let me take an example. Ficus trees and fig wasps are mutually dependent. The ficus trees are keystone resource provider for frugivores animals, and these frugivores in turn are the essential seed dispersal agents for a wide range of plants. Fig flowers are pollinated by small, highly specialized fig wasp, which mature inside the developing fruit. The fig wasps are one of the best examples of keystone mutualis. In this case, the health of fig tree population depends upon the health of their wasp pollinators, and in turn fig wasps rely on them for food and for their development. This mutualistic relationship between trees and the wasps form the foundation of the entire community's health. The fourth category of keystone species is ecosystem engineers. Organisms modify the physical environment, thereby providing resources to other species. Organisms provide habitat to some species which would not have been available otherwise due to disturbance in the physical habitat. The organisms bringing out such structural alterations have been referred to as ecosystem engineers. They can be called as keystone species if their effects are large and disproportionate to their abundance. This function of ecosystem engineers is best illustrated by dam building beavers, nest buildings by ants and termites, vegetation destruction by elephants, and hole drilling by woodpeckers, willow creation by alligators, and burrowing by rabbits, moles, rats, earthworm action in soil, etc. There are so many examples of ecosystem engineers. Normally, the provision of habitat and other resource is incidental of engineering activity of keystone species. The benefiting organism gets adapted to exploit the resource and is considered as opportunist. For example, the red-napped sapsuckers abundant nesting holes are occupied by two species of swallow. Not only this, its feeding holes in willows provide sap flows for a variety of birds, mammals, and insects. Thus, its engineering activity prove a good example of incidental provider of both food and habitat, that too of disproportionate importance. Termites, one of the true ecosystem engineers, exhibit a keystone species in Brazilian Cerrado community. Apart from termites, many other occupants such as ants, beetles, flies, wasps, bees, scorpion, centipedes, spiders, lizards, snake, mice, and birds were recorded in termite mounds. This shows a high degree of adaptation in the benefiting species. The elimination of termites from this community would affect drastically community structure and species diversity. Sometimes it is difficult to distinguish the keystone role of an organism as a predator or an engineer. It is best illustrated by large grazers who act as ecosystem engineers as well as herbivores. By grazing, they suppressed the invasion of woody species and helped in maintaining open grassland vegetation. They exhibit a classical example where they profoundly alter the physical structure of the community. In assessing the keystone role of an organism as an ecosystem engineer, it is necessary to explore how profound the physical effect is, what is the ratio of disproportion, and how many other species benefit out of it, and what is the rate of their dependence on the alterations. Now, let we come to the loss of keystone species and the effects of the loss of keystone species. The loss of keystone species can lead to series of extinction efforts known as extinction cascade. This reduces the biodiversity at all trophic levels. Let me take one example. Over-harvesting in tropical forests has significantly reduced the populations of birds and mammals that act as seed dispersers, predators and herbivores. Such type of forest looks green and healthy superficially, but actually it is an empty forest where all the ecological processes have been irreversibly altered, thereby eliminating various plant and animal species. Over the succeeding decades or centuries. Thus, keystone species not only maintain the ecosystem structure and function, but also the persistence of many other species. Concern about loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity is defined as the variety of life forms, the ecological roles they play and the genetic diversity they contain. Their habitat and landscape diversity is also considered. To maintain redundancy in an ecosystem, a single species or a group of species carry out major functions and provide links in the food web. While analyzing the impacts of removal or addition of species, it is necessary to explore whether it is a keystone species or not, since their loss will alter the community structure and disturb the ecosystem functioning. However, invasive species often become a keystone species that reduces diversity. Now, what are the implications of loss of biodiversity? The loss of biodiversity may lead to reduction in species and genetic diversity, particularly in agricultural and forest ecosystem, results in some short term benefits such as propagation of specialized and high yielding varieties in large areas of croplands and forest. However, over dependency on small number of varieties reduce crop diversity. For example, out of 537 varieties of rice, only 78 are cultivated in India. This requires more amount of chemicals and energy to prevent them from getting scarce. Like ruthless use of insecticide has resulted in the loss of natural enemies of the pest, and now reinvestment is required to reinstate them in the food chain in order to maintain natural biological control and stabilize the natural ecosystem. Means, if we do any such activity, that may lead to a vicious circle, then result in change of climate. For example, increase in rice cultivation areas contributes methane by approximately 1.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions, which cause global warming and climate change, and invites new diseases and attack of pests to a vulnerable variety. Now, what may be the conservation policy and how we go for the conservation management? Bewildering array of species, communities and ecosystem are subjected to variety of internal and external influences, which impose challenges for conservation manager. Due to this complexity and the ever increasing demands for limited resources, the issue is how to maintain indigenous biodiversity and retain functional natural ecosystem. It has been difficult to monitor and manage all aspects of biodiversity, which has further paved the way to focus on either single species or whole ecosystem. So, finally, we can say in this module we have learned what is keystone species, what is the need of keystone species, what are different types of keystone species, what are the impacts of loss of keystone species, and what are the implications of loss of biodiversity, and how to go for the conservation of keystone species. Thank you.